In this paper, we look at early Southern African agroecology as a biocultural heritage for enhancing ESD as transformative learning in school curriculum settings. Around the question, how did emerging biocultural processes of agroecology shape and sustain symbiotic ecologies of practice on living landscapes in Southern Africa? And of course, this would take us immediately to the work of Simon Sharma on landscape and memory, where he points out, for although we are accustomed now to separate nature and human perceptions into two realms, they are in fact indivisible. Before it can ever be a repose of the senses, landscape is the work of the mind. Its scenery is built up as much from strata of memory and intergenerationally as from layers of rock. So, in an ecological perspective, objectively, of course, the various ecosystems that sustain life on the planet proceed independently of human agency, just as they operated before the hectic ascendancy of Homo sapiens. But it's also true that it's difficult to think of a single such natural system that has not, for better or worse, been substantially modified by human culture. So our research examines how evolving biocultural practices shaped living landscapes and embodied patterns of biocultural symbiosis in the region that we can learn from today. So here's the region that we're talking about, the region of Southern Africa, represented by ecology as biomes. But our interest, if we look back, is at the Ziwa and at the Bokoni, and then also into the Tsonga in the 1930s. We're able to see a different process of biocultural transactions, not biomes. And Tits Personai's work on indigenous heritage, along with Sol Shava, Gladys Chacha, and of course Mutizwa Mkute, who worked on the Machubani system, as well as widely across the region, are really important people who provided insights into these. And Caleb Mandikonza, co-author of the paper, comes from the Chimani area in southeastern Zimbabwe, Wilma in the grasslands of the Bloemfontein area, and of course I now live in KwaZulu-Natal. So when we look at this map, we can see that there's the savanna, the brown, and there's the pink of the grasslands. But they are the most dominant areas made up of grasses and forests and woodland and thicket, in which human beings have had a shaping influence. So if we're going to be contemplating science knowledge and the knowledge curation as a continuum of network process skills over time, then we're able to start looking at knowledge that was acquired in a place and amongst people, often over multiple generations. It's accumulated. And then you've got knowledge that is widely generalizable abstractions that one often finds in modern institutional settings. Now, to get a picture of this, it's important to note that humans are, by nature, predisposed to mainly orientate themselves with knowledge. That's what Norbert Elias says, taking it further, that throughout the earliest stages of the development of humanity, their fund of reality-congruent knowledge grew very, very slowly. So if we're able to see this slow growth of knowledge on this continuum, then it's possible to note that the network knowledge curation and imperial methods enable scientific institutions to develop strong self-correcting mechanisms into the modern world. So knowledge can be seen, and sciences can be seen, across this continuum, where often the idealizing and mythic knowledge comes to be examined in close observations, and then research can produce more reality-congruent knowledge. So real-world close encounter experiences can be the foundations upon which knowledge is created in communities as they confront difficulties and challenges. And then, of course, you get this networked in the community and in wider networks as we move into the modern world. So network knowledge deliberation is the process of the curating of knowledge. Now, if we look at the rise of ecology in colonial modernity, then developing ecological sciences inscribed the wonders of nature in an ecological canon within a perception of nature without humans. This is a key point, shaping the ecological sciences within an Arcadian sense of a balance in nature in the early days. And this pointed to environmental degradation and pollution as problems of people out of balance in nature, suffering from unawareness and the need to learn new ecological ways of being. Through environmental education as experiential immersion in nature is how it first started, and I was involved in those early days with eco-encounters and challenges to solve sustainability problems together. So enter the eco-center, a site of ecological enlightenment through nature awareness. And of course, those centers have evolved and developed over the years, but somewhat blind to the early biocultural symbiosis in many indigenous ecologies of practice across the region. Now, if we look at a simple model of ecology as systems and processes within an earth system, and we use this in the early days of ecology, around a simple proposition that our words condense into pictures as foundations for stories to guide land care ethics. A very simple idea where we've got air and soil and water, and what we're able to do is to see the way that the sun powers the system of producers, consumers, and decomposers, or in water systems, microscopic plants, animals, and detritus. And here what one has is the production base, and then you have the production base using oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. And what happens is they are able to then have energy dispersing through the system, and that energy goes through the consumers. And here we use the oxygen and reproduce carbon dioxide. And what we're able to do then is to see the way that energy flows through an ecosystem and how nutrients cycle through the decomposition. You get minerals and nutrients being actually recycled. So these simple models were used, and were indigenous ecologies of practice latently destructive, as was implied, and do they reflect a developing capital of biocultural symbiosis until the rapid change that wrought in community, in colonial modernity, to produce the problems that we face today. So if we go into the Moyombo, for instance, and we start looking at the phenology, the seasonal patterns of the Moyombo, we see that the early indigenous people were able to build up relational dynamics around the availability of wild foods and grasses and fruits during the flowering time of the summer, where they lived on the uplands. And the reason for living in the uplands is because they couldn't bring their cattle down because of the Nagana cattle disease. But when the cattle disease receded across the region during the dry times, then the Mapani, fruits and geophytes and grasses, herbs and shrubs, with an expanded flowering time, also came into the mix. So you started to get cultural phenology that was woven into or in a symbiotic relationship with the seasonal cycles. Now, if we take it into the agroecology, in this case in the Limpopo littoral coastal area, where many different groups live, but primarily the Tsonga, what you get is wild fruits and hunting as the foundation from earlier times. And then you start getting sorghum and cassava and other crops that people grew until maize came in, and maize required innovations where people started to use nutrients and fertilize their crops with cattle dung. Then you have also alongside that potatoes, sweet potatoes, and various other crops like pumpkins and calabashes. and peas and beans, and people would prepare their fields at different times. So you start seeing here, again, ecologies of practice and symbiotic relational dynamics that played out in the seasonal cycles. Now, if we look at these, drawing on the way that villages were made up of permanent cultivation, zones that were fallowed, zones that were shifting, and that there was the spaces for hunting and collecting, especially amongst groups like the Bokoni, who mapped it on rocks, the organization of the village, you're able to get a sense that there was this land taming process where people were expanding agroecologies. They lived in villages as survival units within agroecological landscapes in southern Africa. And if we model these, we can see that the taming of the land from Chigwedere, for instance, who researched this quite extensively. You have village households, you have cattle kraals, izala dumps, and arable lands, water sources. So what you had is an expanding agroecological cultural landscape. And you are able to see that the processes, the figurations that people made, the activities that they did, came to shape the landscape. So what one's able to do then is to say the African savanna can be read as a mosaic biocultural system of dry forests, open woodlands, grasslands, and thicket. The Moyombo, for example, of the Central Plateau, for example, is a fire climax system with over 50 edible plant species, with fruits were harvested from November to February. Over centuries of agroecological and climatic interaction, Southern Africa developed living landscapes within which village survival units learned to thrive. And in the thriving in these agroecological systems, they built new systems of practice. And here, for the Bokoni, you've got the development of the terracing. And when you locate a lot of these cultures in Central African plateau areas, then what you get is you get a situation where you have the monitoring of the moon and the monitoring of the sun and the seasons as a way of organizing biocultural activity in the agroecology of the region. And we can look at this now through a visit that I recently did to the Zimbabwe.
So here we are with Neva, the anthropologist guide at the Great Zimbabwe. And I am breathless because I climbed up a very steep hill and then a very steep rock to get to the only place where you can see the western, which is the sunshine side, the eastern, which is the sunshine side, and the western, which is the moon side. So if you could just explain that so that I can take it back for my students.
Yeah, sure. So we have here right on top of the hill where such a place that is very significant. Probably it was all just for rituals. So like we are here, we have the eastern side over there. That's a place where usually the sun rises from. So that's the east where we call Zua. That's the sun in our language, which demarcates and shows that there was a place where rituals will be done, like asking for rains and all the stuff, wherever rituals will be done, even today, whenever they're necessary and deemed necessary to be done and performed. Then we have these other western part of the site.
And there's a tunnel between them, is there?
Yeah, there's a tunnel down there between them, which was a tunnel like as a defense, one at a point, and also at some point the tunnel, that's where kings were buried. So this other side, on the western side, we refer to as the moon side, which is Moedzi, that is in our vernacular language. So these are the two places that are connected to one another, and so this was such significance in the religious place.
Well, thanks very much, Neva.
Well, thanks very much, Neva. It'll be very useful. So we're able to see that there were these depth of synergies that were around. And in the cropping that one finds, the sorghum, for instance, and the advent of maize, these agroecological systems changed and shifted. And if you take the biography of Casmain, what you find is that in the seed saving and in the whole development, what you got is now the advent of the politics of apartheid and the ecologies of change that occurred with the modern era, so that Casmain, from a sharecropper, ended up indigent because of the social exclusions and because of the ways in which the politics of colonial modernity operated. So it's important to take a broader view than just the agroecological view when one's dealing with these things. And now, if we go back again, we can see that there's talk about imifino, that it cannot be an indigenous heritage because nowadays it's mostly alien plants, weeds. But if you look at this more deeply, you can start seeing that these edible plants had a biocultural symbiotic process through cattle, and the adaptive learning that produced the habitat change within colonial modernity produced new food plants, the imifino that produced as weeds, and people were able to take these up as food that were iron rich and that were important for women's health in particular. And of course, Gladys Chacha was a person who sustained these cultural ecological practices, and we used to enjoy eating imifino with her every Friday. So if we take these fragments of agroecological heritage and we look at how have they been illuminating symbolic ecologies of practice that we can bring into our work in schools, then we can start off with the phonology, the balance that occurred between people and the possibilities of life. Then we can look at the way that farming developed in southern Africa and how these can be described in the dynamics of circular process of hunting and driving and land clearing and innovation and development, so that you didn't have stagnation in southern Africa. You had a dynamic cultural process that occurred there with innovation when it came to managing the climatics of the area, managing the nutrients for plants to be cultivated. Then, of course, you had the seasonal cycles, the measurement of these, spirituality associated with that, with ceremonies, and you had the advent of radical change through innovation, and you had the impositions of the colonial period. And all of these are reflected in this picture of agroecological transactions in the region. So some of the insights that we can draw from this are that our ecological biomes are a living legacy of biocultural agroecology, and that the patterns of developing biocultural symbiosis can be uncovered to inform learning. So that's what we'd like to do in the latter part of this paper. So let's have a look at imifino against this biocultural heritage and examine it as a symbiotic biocultural process of health creation that we can learn from today. So the question then is, can evidence of early biocultural symbiosis be taken up into handprint action learning and real-life learning labs as change projects? And we owe the credit to the real-life learning labs, to cooperative work that we did with partners in Africa. So if we're looking at co-creating living landscapes for health, rights and peace in Southern Africa, then we're looking at taming of the land and the processes whereby this taming produced this landscape through Chitumeni practices in the Muyombo, the agroecologies that developed subsequent to that, the continuous use and changing patterns of imifino, the Mosuelo, the seed sharing cultural practices associated with that, and then also bringing in here Ukugelesha, the seasonal migration of the Xhosa, during the drought time. Now, if we look across this, we've got plenty of heritage story that can be taken into our cultures of teaching and learning as knowledgescapes activating land care ethics. And we can develop, as Wilma always refers to, what are the practical tools that we can use in this teaching and learning. And here, if we take the cycle for the handprint learning, we're able to say that if we take a heritage of learning of intergenerational words and pictures and stories and life experience, words, pictures and stories, we can take them into story sharing, inquiry, deliberation and change, and into the inspire process of real life learning. So that if we take the curriculum activated handprint action learning towards the real life learning labs change projects on learning pathways activated, for example, in the emerging YOMA micro modules that Wilma and partners at the Environmental Learning Center are doing with youth, then the youth are curating knowledge and developing skills with the help of ELRC staff towards learner-led societal self-correction mechanisms for symbiotic ecologies of practice. And this change is starting to evolve in quite a significant way. So that it's possible now in the curriculum work to begin to put together knowledgescapes for co-engaged lesson planning around heritage, where you've got story around Imifino and a book that we're producing on Imifino with some help from local people. You're starting to get the intersectional knowledges being reflected in the materials so that heritage trading zones and learning across heritage becomes visible. Then the students are able to take up concerns using the Sustainable Development Goals and taking up real life learning challenges. And then this can go into action tools with the tools that they can use for social innovation in real life learning as an action research change challenge process that has a lot of hope. And this work is developing well and quite fast. So here are some of the publications that we've got. Not all of them are currently available because the research papers that with the real life learning lab approach are still embargoed from publication by request of the Free University of Amsterdam, the Inspire project, that we derived a lot of the inspiration for this work from, and the EU Erasmus Secretariat. So there's still work on the learning labs and climate. There's a lot of work on case stories of heritage for inclusion in learning lab approaches. There's been research that we've done on real life learning in the situation of climate change. We have been looking at food systems. We've been looking at heritage and leafy greens. This paper on agroecology, and more work on exploring dialectics of transformation within online course-mediated expansive learning that will come up in the work that we're going to take to Finland, to the conference there with Hela Lotz Sasitka in June. So these papers will become available. We welcome you commenting on the paper that goes with this presentation, and we look forward to sharing a lot of ideas with you as these ideas develop.